Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. I am Vadim Perlovsky, and today we are excited to welcome the #1 best-selling single malt Scotch in the world, the Glenfiddich. Joining us to represent the Glenfiddich is Dave Allardice, or otherwise known as Dave Paradise. He comes to us well acclaimed by the lovely Jennifer Wren, so I'm excited to hear all about Glenfiddich and get to know Dave as we go through this tasting. We have some really exciting expressions in front of us. We of course have the classic 12-year, the 14, the 15, and then the 21, the 23, and an optional add-on at the end. But that said, I see a lot of familiar faces today. Welcome everyone. We know how we do these things. We have fun, we hang out, we ask nerdy questions. That's why we're all here. And yeah, Dave, let's pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Vadim. Okay, so I can see a bunch of you there just getting ready to drink some whiskey with me. Thanks for joining us. Show your hand if you are more than likely to ask a question at some point tonight. 1, 2, 3, maybe 50% of people. Good. Maybe as we get a couple of whiskies into the evening, that number will go up, because this definitely is a lot more fun when it's a little back and forth than just, you know, someone speaking at you. Because obviously, as whiskey folks, we can talk all night, but we don't really want that. We want to get in, we want to taste some things, we want to learn something new and have a bit of fun with it. So it's great that you're all giving up some of your Friday night to drink some whiskey with us. And as you can tell, I'm not from the US. I'm actually from Scotland, but I've been living in the US for quite a while. So I will throw out a y'all here and there. And you might hear some Americanisms coming out of my mouth, because I've been in the States for almost 17 years. I even have this mug here, which an Irish friend of mine, MJ, she gave me that when I got my US citizenship. So I'm legal and ready to drink some single malt with you this evening. Hopefully there's a few things in the lineup tonight that you haven't tasted, so I'll kind of ask as we go along. Traditionally, I think most people would just kind of start and go from youngest to oldest. Nothing wrong with that. We'll probably do that, with the exception of, I think I'd like to start with the 14-year-old rather than the 12, if that's okay with you. Just the reason is that, well, a couple of reasons, but the main reason is that I think the 14 is quite an easy whiskey to start off with. Not that the 12 isn't, but the 14-year-old is just aged using American oak. There's no sherry casks, there's no other finish. It's quite straightforward. So I feel like it's quite a nice whiskey to start the evening with. It's a little sweeter than I would say the 12-year-old is as well. So also the other reason I was thinking is that quite often, if it is, and a show of hands, is this your first drink of the day? I'm guessing no for a lot of you. There's a few liars in the crew tonight. All right, cool. Well, it's definitely my first drink of the day, but I did have a mojito yesterday, so it's nice to warm up the palate with something like a cocktail or a beer. I find, you know, whiskey essentially was beer before it became whiskey, right? So it's, what better way to prepare your palate for a whiskey than with a beer? That's my favorite pairing, you know, beer or cigars. You know, we could get into talking about food and everything, but those are my favorite things to pair with a nice whiskey. But usually the first whiskey of the day is going to be a little bit of a shock to the palate, even for you know, the seasoned drinkers out here. So sometimes when you always start with the 12-year-old, the 12-year-old sometimes gets kind of a bad rap, because it's kind of the whiskey that warms you up, and it's nice to try something different, and then we can appreciate the 12-year-old for what it is. So if you don't mind, let's kick off. Before we start, does anyone have anything they want to ask just straight off the bat? Any comments, questions?
The 14 is a fairly recent release, as of a couple of years ago, right? It was added to kind of get the bourbon drinkers into the Scotch.
Yeah, not too long ago. Probably about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe now.
Well, the last three don't count because it was COVID.
Also true, yeah. So yeah, it's only been out for a few years in real money terms. It was specifically introduced to the US to appeal or to attract American whiskey or bourbon drinkers to single malt Scotch. Obviously, it's a fairly common cross reference of palates. You know, with when it comes to whiskey, I'll drink some Irish, I'll drink some Japanese, I'll drink some American. You know, I do really love single malt Scotch for obvious reasons, but I like to mix it up. But we wanted to attract some people that were, you know, real kind of American whiskey drinkers that maybe hadn't thought of drinking single malt Scotch whiskey. Just look in the chat here real quick. What's the order? There we go. 14, 12, 15, 21, 23. Perfect. So 14-year-old, you don't need to use a fancy glass like this, but I see some of you already have Glencairns. I got the little even fancier version. So Alex, are you downing a whiskey there, or are you just emptying your glass? Yeah, 14 and 12 is the only thing that's out of order in terms of going from youngest to oldest. So most of what we're going to drink tonight, I think everything actually is going to be either 40 or 43% ABV. So when we do whiskey tasting, some people like to add water, some people like to add ice, do whatever the hell you want. But with whiskies that are only 40, 43%, you probably agree that they don't really need a whole lot of help. They're already quite soft and quite ready to go. Good thing about these glasses is you can get a good sniff. So straight away, I kind of smell like a little bit like a candy shop with the 14-year-old. And I'm not one of these people that goes into super elaborate tasting notes. The first time I ever went to a Scotch whiskey tasting, there was a guy, his name is Nicholas Polacki. He used to work for the Balvenie. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Glenfiddich and the Balvenie are both part of the same family company, William Grant and Sons. So the two distilleries are right there in the heart of Speyside, next door to each other. And Nicholas was the brand ambassador for Balvenie. So he comes down to Dallas to do a tasting. I was living in Dallas, Texas at the time. And he starts the tasting by, you know, kind of ripping it out of these wine somms and you know, people that host tastings by saying, I'm getting daffodils picked by left-handed virgins on a Tuesday morning in April. And it was like the perfect antidote to those kind of cheesy tasting notes. So I'll try to stay away from doing those as much as possible tonight. Without any further ado, we'd like to get into the whiskey and taste it, shouldn't we? So in Scotland, we always start with a toast. We would traditionally say Slàinte, which means to your good health. You can shorten that to Slàinte. We also, you know, share some common language with the Irish, so you'll be familiar that they say that when they're toasting as well. So, but when we're amongst friends, we can say Slàinte, or we can say what my good friend Ian Miller says, and that is up yours. So up yours. So I like to chew on it for a few seconds. This one settles in. Like I said, it's quite straightforward. You know, single malt Scotch whiskey tends to be quite complex, a lot going on, quite often quite a long finish. This whiskey is very straightforward. It's only aged in American oak, so 14 years in the blue label, 14 years in ex-bourbon barrels, so nothing strange or unusual about that when you come to Scotch whiskey. You know, we don't have the same rules and regulations that you have in the bourbon world here. We don't have to use brand new toasted charred American oak barrels. We can use the used ones. So as you know, in Scotland, we're quite frugal, we're quite financially responsible, and we like to get a bargain. So we'll take in these used barrels and we'll use them to age our Scotch. But we can use new barrels as well. So in order to get back to the whole idea of what this whiskey, this 14-year-old was about, was to attract American whiskey drinkers. So we wanted to age the whiskey as close as possible to the style that you would get in American whiskey, or in bourbon specifically, with using the new oak barrels. So 14 years in the ex-bourbon barrels, used bourbon barrels. And then we flip those barrels into brand new charred white American oak barrels, so virgin casks. And we leave them in those casks for about 4 months. So it's what we would call a finish, right? You're familiar with finishing. Finishing in new oak barrels in Scotland is not super common. Hands up if anyone's not familiar with the term finishing. I assume everyone is, but if you're not, that's fine. So yeah, it's just another option of aging in a different type of barrel, obviously, right? You guys are all familiar, it seems. So we just decided we wanted to take some inspiration from the American whiskey world, and that's what we did with this one. So probably about $55 to $60 a bottle, depending on where you are. Is anyone not in California? Is everyone LA based, or is everyone California based? Jason's not in California. Where are you, Jason?
I'm outside of Detroit.
Oh, cool. Love Detroit. Used to go there a lot. Used to go there 2 or 3 times a year. Ferndale and Birmingham, and in more recent years, did downtown Detroit as well.
I'm in Youngstown, Ohio.
You're in Ohio?
Yep.
Cool. Whereabouts?
Youngstown.
Okay, not super familiar. Been to Cleveland.
Just outside of Cleveland.
Got it. Been to Cleveland, and then we went to Huron, I think it was, to visit.
Sandusky.
Are you familiar with the Chef's Garden?
No.
It was kind of weird. We did a work trip up there. Usually we go to a distillery of some sort, and we went up to Ohio. No one knew why we were going to Ohio. And we get to Ohio, and we take a bus ride 2 hours from Cleveland, and we end up in this farm where they grow 1 million different types of vegetables and customize it. So if a chef in Hawaii needs a 3-inch white carrot, they can do it. It's a pretty amazing place, even for a meat eater. So any comments on the 14 or any questions? This is lovely. Lemon and honey, soft and only just sweet. Yeah, I agree. It's not sweet. It's not sickly sweet like some bourbons might be. That's not a dig. That's just my interpretation of some of them. Left-handed virgin daffodils. Yep, exactly. On the money there, Brian. Tropical fruits and vanilla. Wonderful. I mean, when it comes to these tasting notes, it's absolutely an individual personal preference or exploration. We went to this place in Edinburgh called the Scotch Whisky Research Institute years ago, and they showed us that they have this kind of a mechanical nose that they can sit a glass of whiskey under it, and this nose detects aromas, and it charts them based on their compound makeup, their chemical compound structure, whatever you call it, and it would plot them in this graph over a 2-hour period. And essentially what they would find is your average single malt Scotch whisky would have somewhere between 80 and 100 different aromas that could be found. And this was fairly typical across different brands and different expressions. So if you're picking up nail varnish, or you're picking up, daffodils that were picked by left-handed virgins, there's a chance that you could be actually picking that up. It's just the fact that no one else picks it up doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that maybe you have a more refined.
No, it means they're wrong.
It absolutely could mean they're wrong. They're just not picking up what you're picking up. So it's great to see some people putting their tasting notes and what they're picking up in the chat. Tropical fruit. So with Glenfiddich, so I've been a brand ambassador with Glenfiddich now for over 10 years, and drank a lot of variations of Glenfiddich and of course many other scotches. And the one thing that we are known for is that we are non-peated. So I'll get into that in a little bit for those of you that are not super familiar with that term or exactly what it means. But it's also known to be a very fruity style of Scotch whisky. And that is down to a couple of things. It's not uncommon to have a whisky that you can pick up fruit from. But one of the things about Glenfiddich is that there's a fairly long fermentation process. If you go to, we toured Islay on the west coast of Scotland, which is obviously where most of the smoky Scotches come from. And there was a lot of consistencies from distillery to distillery in terms of their production process. So what we found was that on average, their fermentation time was about 50 to 55 hours. Like Glenfiddich, it's about 70 to 74 hours. And what they say is that the longer the fermentation process is, the more fruity congeners can form. So it's going to be obvious that then the spirit that you produce after that fermentation process is going to be quite fruity. But everyone picks up different types of fruit, so it's interesting to see the different variations: lemon, tropical fruits, some pith. If you're making cocktails with Scotch whisky, bourbon I find can be a bit more direct. First of all, does anyone like to make cocktails with their whisky? A few head nods, no one really dying to show their hand there. Few traditionalists. With bourbon, I find bourbon, yeah, absolutely you get variations within bourbons, no doubt, but I find it to be not quite as wide of a spectrum of variations from bourbon to bourbon, whereas I find with single malt Scotch, you tend to get a wider range of varieties in terms of the flavour profile. So it can be a little bit more challenging to pair a specific single malt for a specific cocktail. But I find that the 14-year-old does substitute a bourbon for specifically an old fashioned, but could be a number of other similar American whiskey type cocktails. But yeah, not everyone's rushing out to put a 14-year-old in their cocktails, apart from bougie brand ambassadors. Kate likes her whiskey neat. Is Kate he or she? Kate, here we are. Oh, I see you. So it's just an unusual spelling of the name. You like it neat? No water, no ice? Nope.
Most of us.
Yeah. Well, they say that in Scotland they only like two things naked, and one of them is whiskey.
But so none of the core range Fiddicks are cast strength or barrel proof or?
No, and you're not going to find that with most single malt scotches. It's very unusual. You'll have to go to the independent bottlers, right?
Yeah.
And that's even more so now, because we used to have a distillery edition that was it 105, I think it was.
Yeah.
You can still find it some places, like in some countries, not in the US. But you know, you're talking about the amount of volume that's going out and the demand for the whiskey. They're like, we can't do high strength. So I would like them to do more high strength. We released a whiskey called Project XX, Project 20, a few years ago. That was 47% ABV, non-chill filtered.
That was good.
Yeah, exactly. So getting a little bit up there, a bit more flavor, can hold up to an ice cube better. But you know, we're dealing with 40, 43, really easy drinking, and appeals to quite a wide palate, quite a wide audience, should I say. All right, so in fact, if you really were trying to find the cask strength Glenfiddich, nowadays you have to go up to like the what do you call it, the rare cask reserves, or the rare cask collection. It's you're talking thousands of dollars for like a 34, 36, 37-year-old.
K&L has had some from time to time under their K&L, which is a local. K&L, yeah. Under their Hepburn's Choice, those have been in the 50% ABVs.
That's right. Yeah, I think the distillery, the independent bottlers are great value. You know, they don't have the same reach in terms of how far they can get their audience, but they do a lot of good value whiskies that are high strength, non-chill filtered, and good pricing. I don't want to talk myself out of a job here. So this was a cool thing that I found recently. Has anyone seen this? This is the Glenfiddich 12-year-old, just in a fancy pack. So it was the Lunar New Year. I actually found this in Mission Liquors. There was quite a few of them still left. And the cool thing is that it comes with a couple glasses, couple branded glasses. So just thought I'd show you that. I have not opened that bottle because that's a collector's item. But the Glenfiddich 12-year-old is what we're going to drink next. So if you look at Glenfiddich as a flavor profile, like I mentioned, it's quite fruity. non-peated. So sure, everyone's got some familiarity with what peat is and what it tastes like and what it does to single malt Scotch whisky. But basically, just to run over it real quick, at the beginning of how we make our delicious spirit, we basically take a barley, dry barley, and we want to trick that barley into growing, and we want to access the starches, convert them into sugars, and get the most amount of sugars out of the barley so we can get the highest yield of alcohol, right? And so what's involved in that process is malting, mashing, fermenting, distilling. So malting is when you take the barley and you basically trick it into growing. So you steep it in water, you then leave it for a couple of days, you bring it back out of the water, you dry it, you air dry it on a floor in a malt barn. Most of this is done commercially now, so most distilleries are not doing this on site. Balvenie is one of the few distilleries that still does a portion of theirs on site, but the vast majority do not have the capability. It's not efficient, it's not cost effective, and just don't have the space. So we use commercial maltsters to order our barley, but the process is this: steep it in water for 2 days, dry it on a stone floor. You've got the guys that would come in and they would turn the barley, get the air into it, get the moisture coming off of it, and eventually you have to take that barley and dry it with a fire. So you take the barley, you put it above the fire on the second floor of the kiln, and it's what's known as a perforated floor. So all of the smoke from the kiln downstairs is coming up, drying the barley, but the smoke is obviously affecting the overall flavor. So if you're using peat, which is basically just big lumps of soil cut out of the ground in Scotland, we can use that as fuel source to dry the barley, but it's not very efficient. But it's what we had at hand a couple hundred years ago. So a lot of distilleries would use that as a fuel source to dry the barley, and it would attach this phenolic content to the barley, phenols, and that's what we know as the smoky, peaty character. Is the phenols that come from that peat. So when we started to get the introduction of railways into Scotland, a lot of distilleries decided it wasn't effective or efficient to use peat, and it also gave this smoky character. So they started to use smokeless coal to dry the barley. So that means you now have the ability to dry your barley much more efficiently, and also without adding that smoky character. So some distilleries decided to keep the smokiness, the peaty approach, and a lot of them, in fact, most of them decided to abandon that. So that's why when you hear people say, I don't like Scotch because it's smoky, in reality, the majority of it is not smoky. So, you just have to try a few more. And certainly with Glenfiddich, we're not using peat. We're not using a barley that has been treated with peat. So that's why you're not going to smell a glass of Glenfiddich and say, smells like Lagavulin, or it smells like Laphroaig, or Ardbeg for that matter. So your 12-year-old, you're going to have two different styles of aging. Do we have any comments here? Just a touch of plum. Fruit, creamy butterscotch. Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, this 12-year-old is a great whiskey. It just is so ubiquitous. It often gets overlooked. And, for most of us whiskey geeks, we want to try something we haven't tried. We want to try something unusual. But when you come back to the tried and tested, the big ones, they do actually deliver a lot, especially a great bang for buck. So we'll get into this. Cheers, up yours, and Slangevar. So one thing that you can definitely say about Glenfiddich, it's a clean spirit. It's not musty. It's not got any off notes. It's really, really, it's delicate. It's fruity. It's clean. But I find it does get more interesting the older you get. So once you get up to I love the 15. We're going to get into that in a second. Once you get up to 15 and above, it really starts to bring a bit more depth and character. But the 12 for me is like vanilla ice cream. It's a people pleaser. It's easy going. You're looking at two maturation styles here. Okay, so the common theme you're going to find, obviously, with single malts is that, we started with the 14, Brian, just because I decided that two things. The 14 just has a little bit more of a direct, simple profile, a little bit sweeter. And the 12-year-old often just gets overlooked. So it's nice to kind of warm your palate with something different rather than just the 12-year-old all the time. So the common theme with Scotch whisky is that we're using ex-bourbon American oak barrels. Okay, so that's when we say this whiskey is aged in bourbon barrels, we're basically just saying, yeah, this whiskey was aged. The second most common type, someone can throw it in the chat. What's the second? Good, Vadim. Yeah, the second most common type of cask is the sherry cask, and those are slightly different type of oak. So Quercus alba is the American oak, and the name for European oak, which would be the sherry casks, is Quercus robur. Two different types of oak. One thing we have to do in whiskey making is age in oak. We can't age in any other type of wood. It always has to be oak. So whether it's Russian or where are we at? Friggin' Nordic. You can't use anything outside of oak when it comes to most whiskies. Certainly not single malt Scotch. So with Glenfiddich, your 12-year-old, your 15-year-old, your 18-year-old, actually just about every whiskey we do, except for the 14, is going to touch American oak and a little bit of European oak, so bourbon and sherry casks. Slightly different ratio, slightly different proportion for each expression. But typically what you'll find is when you go from 12 years old upwards towards 30 years old, when we get to 30 years old, we're adding about 30% sherry cask aging, right, with 70% bourbon cask, whereas with the 12-year-old, it's closer to about 15% sherry cask. But you see the trend, it's predominantly American oak. American oak is just, there's more of it, it's easier to get. But in terms of the flavor, what it doesn't overpower the whiskey as much as the European oak does. So it's a little bit more kind to the distillery character. It allows the distillery character to still shine through without dominating it. Now, if you put together 5 different 12-year-olds, for example, from 5 different Scotch whisky producers, and they were all aged exclusively in American oak, you would be able to pick out the distillery characters much easier than if you did the same experiment using just 5 different sherry casks, because the sherry cask tends to kind of overpower and dominate it. But it adds complexity, it adds layers of spice, it has a bit of dryness. It can add a lot of different flavor profiles that are really complementary.
And I'm guessing this is Oloroso sherry?
Yeah, Oloroso sherry, yeah, unless otherwise stated. With Glenfiddich, it's almost exclusively Oloroso sherry. We are going to actually, yeah.
Is it a finish or is it a marriage?
No, great question. So it's what we would call a marriage, right? So we could use the word blend, mix, whatever. We use the word marriage because sometimes people, when they hear the word blend, they start to get confused. Single malt Scotch whisky, really. So if you look at, the marriage, let me tell you the marriage is. Basically, we'll age a bunch of our whiskey for 12 years in American oak, and we'll age a load of our whiskey in sherry cask for 12 years. And as we get those casks ready, we'll say, okay, well, we need 15% from the sherry and 85% from the bourbon. So we'll get that ratio, we'll blend it together, and then we'll leave that mixture, that marriage, in a slightly larger wooden vessel called a marrying tun. You could use a steel vat, but David Stewart, who is the malt master for Balvenie, he decided many years ago that at the William Grant & Sons distilleries, we would use these marrying tuns, which are custom made. They hold about typically 2,000 litres upwards. And that's what we use for the final marriage of these different types of whiskies before it goes to bottling. So that's the process for basically pretty much all of our whiskies.
And what are those made of?
Those are made out of oak, but because they're so large, they're not classified as aging vessels. If your barrel or your cask is more than 700 litres in volume, it doesn't matter how long you put the whiskey in there. It's not registering any time as maturation time. So you have to have your barrel be, so a sherry butt is typically 500 litres. A port pipe is, I think, closer to 6. And then an American oak barrel is about 200 litres. So But if you were to custom make one of these tons and put whiskey in there, it ain't aging. It's just a vessel for it to fuse together naturally. Which will bring us on to the 15-year-old, which does have a slight variation and a slightly different story to it in terms of that marriage process. So if you're ready now, if anyone's got a splash of water there and you still have some 12-year-olds, if you fancy it, have a little drop. Some whiskies take water better than others. The 12-year-old really softens up and sweetens up with a little hint of water, so it actually works really nicely in that one.
I have a question as far as aging.
Yep.
So I didn't know about the finishing ton, that there is a size maximum for barrels, so the finishing ton doesn't do anything. Is it possible hypothetically to marry it and then finish it, add more age after it's been in the finishing ton? In the marrying ton?
Yeah, and that happens.
Okay.
So we'll actually talk about that with the 21-year-old. But yeah, absolutely, you can do that. Yeah, nothing wrong with that at all.
So essentially you would just pause the time,
Yep.
you do whatever, and then start it.
Yeah, it's a completely permitted part of the process. So, and in fact, if you were going to remember that all these whiskies, none of these whiskies that we're drinking tonight are single casks, right? So they are all batched from many, many barrels. So those barrels have to be batched somewhere. Now, most distilleries will just have some sort of a steel vat that they'll use, and that's perfectly all right. But for the purposes of Glenfiddich and Balvenie, the main man, David Stewart, who's been with our company now for approaching 60 years, he makes these suggestions to the team, and every now and again someone will come around and challenge him and say, David, this is not cost effective, we've got a better way, we think, try this, blah blah blah. And he's like, well, if you're asking me what I think is best for the whiskey, then I'm going to tell you the answer. As humble as he is, but that's his job, is to give the best answer in terms of questions of quality. So he seems to think that it's a better process to use these slightly older, more old school techniques. Okay, where were we?
I just want to say that I almost didn't believe you when you said add a drop of water to the 12-year-olds, but I thought, well, what the heck, I'll give it a try. I'm really surprised how much flavor it brought out. I mean,
It's
a
honestly,
whole different thing.
yeah, and it doesn't work for all whiskies, and it doesn't work for everyone. There's some people that will do that and they'll say, I preferred it the way it was. Maybe some of that is psychological, because people sometimes want to believe that straight as the distillery intended it out the bottle is the way to drink it. And the way I look at it is like, it's a little bit like coffee. If you went to Costa Rica or something and you start putting milk and sugar in their coffee, they'll probably have a fit. But in Scotland, we are very, very well aware of the magic of what water does to whiskey. One thing you'll realize is that the ABV is going to determine how much water you should put in. So if it is only 40% or 42%, you literally only want to put a drop or two, or a tiny teaspoon, really just as small a drop as you can. If you've got something a little bit more robust, a higher strength, it can hold up to ice. It can hold up, should I be allowed to say that? But it can hold up to more water. Now, something that I discovered, which I'm not the only person to discover this, but I asked a question to Brian Kinsman. So David Stewart, malt master for Balvenie, once upon a time looked after all of William Grant's whiskies, now only looks after the Balvenie. He trained the current master distiller for Glenfiddich, whose name is on the bottles, Brian Kinsman. He's been with Glenfiddich now for over 20 years, but he did a 9 or 10 year apprenticeship underneath David Stewart. And what was I going to say there? I was so busy concentrating on the air conditioning unit. I was like, I wonder if they can hear that. Okay, well, let me. Oh, the water. Yeah. So I was talking about sherry casks in terms of adding water. And I noticed that the sherry cask whiskies, especially if it's purely sherry cask aged, they can collapse under whiskey much easier for some reason. And I said to Brian Kinsman, I was like, what's the story with sherry cask whiskies and the addition of water? And says it tends to, have you noticed that it tends to, like I'm saying, have you noticed? Of course he's noticed. But you know, there's something about the sherry casks that they can't withstand as much water as the American oak whiskies. So kind of a weird discovery there. He acknowledged it. He agreed with me. He didn't have an answer as to why. So again, some things are not able to be explained as easily. Shifting gears, 15. This was the expression of Glenfiddich that got me into Scotch whisky. I was a beer swilling, rum and coke drinking, cigarette smoking, actually, hooligan many years ago. And I didn't know anything about flavor. I didn't know anything about whiskey. I didn't know anything about food, nothing. Wine, completely useless, right? Try some dark chocolate with these. Absolutely. Great suggestion. So I was introduced to Scotch whisky 12, 13 years ago through a glass of the 15-year-old. And it was a friend of mine who worked for the company. She actually called me tonight. I spoke to her first time in years or months. And it was just a complete kind of an accident. She's like, well, you're Scottish, you like people, you should come and work for us. And I says, well, I'll have to like whiskey first. So let's see if we can get that over the first hurdle. And she handed me a glass, tasted it, loved it, was shocked. And that was my journey into whiskey. Does anyone have a similar kind of memory of their first whiskey when they first really enjoyed a whiskey? Yeah. Jane, do you want to share it or not?
Honestly, it was not a whiskey that was particularly fabulous, but I didn't know that whiskey could be anything other than something that practically set the house on fire from across the room. My grandpa had a still in the backyard, so it was White Lightning pretty much. It wasn't really ever aged. It was just, you know, White Dog is a nicer phrase,
Yeah.
but it really didn't apply. Lightning was pretty much it because it literally would set everything on fire.
But it got you into whiskey.
Yeah, I was always fascinated by the stuff. My parents pretty much had to forbid my grandfather from giving me any more until I was at least 15. So
Awesome. At least 15.
yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're drinking something that is at least of that age. Okay, just looking in the chat here. So try some dark chocolate with these. You know, I mentioned food pairing with Scotch whisky. It's not the easiest thing to pair, in my opinion, but the obvious things like cheese and dark chocolate really do work. You can mess around with different levels of cocoa, obviously, and different brands and whatnot, different even slightly flavored. So a dark chocolate with a hint of orange or ginger would be quite complementary to the 15-year-old.
What type of cheese would you eat with this?
A blue cheese, but probably not the heaviest, most what's the word? Not the most pungent of blue cheeses, I would say. You know, you don't want to go too far, but something that has a nice creaminess to it and a good amount of flavor. Something that I think is a milder cheese, I think would just get obliterated, right?
Right, and a cheddar would clash.
Well, I was going to say a cheddar could work. It just depends on you know, if it was over the top sharp. Humboldt Fog, London Fog cheese. Not familiar with these. Not big up on cheese. Christmas clove, orange, fig jam, dark chocolate, dried fruits. Great tasting though. It's honey and vanilla.
I was going to say the provolone I have sitting next to me is not bad with the 15.
Okay, excellent. Maybe I'll go to Jersey Mike's after this and get a provolone sub. Okay, so the 15-year-old whiskey that got me into whiskey is aged somewhat similarly in the beginning to the 12-year-old. American oak, ex-bourbon, European oak, ex-sherry cask. Also the addition of a little bit of new oak. So let me explain. We get 15-year-old Glenfiddich aged American oak, used bourbon. We transfer some of those into brand new charred American oak, right? Virgin casks, just for a few months. So now we have two different components, 15-year-old bourbon, 15-year-old plus bourbon with a little new oak finish. Then we have 15-year-old European sherry cask, Glenfiddich. 3 different components. What do we do? You know what's next. We throw them into the marrying tun, except with the 15 specifically, it's a slightly more special, larger marrying tun. It's called the Solera Vat. So this is called the Solera 15, and it's a process I've been using specifically for the 15-year-old Glenfiddich since 1998, when David Stewart decided he wanted to copy or imitate and even modify the Solera process that you could find in the sherry world or even the rum world, where essentially you're mixing a little bit of an older product with a slightly younger product in order to not only generate more interesting flavors and balance out some of the maturity with slightly more vibrant flavors, but it also gives you consistency, right? So as we all know, if you love single malt or single cask whiskies, they all are individually slightly different, even if it's the same age from the same distillery. Like Balvenie 15-year-old sherry cask single barrel is a great example of that. You pick up 2 different ones from the store. One says on it cask 1582, and it's really dark. And you pick up another bottle from the store, and it happens to be from another batch, cask 185, and it's much lighter. They're both Balvenie 15s. They're both the same price. They're both the same ABV, because they're capped at 47.8 for that one, but they taste differently. So when you want to sell the product and have it be the same every time, like we do with this, then you have to have a mixture of many barrels to get that consistency. So that's what we've done. We've poured those 3 barrels that I spoke about earlier into the Solera vat. The Solera vat is big enough for this entire, if it was a hot tub, we could all get in it. But it's not a hot tub. It's full of cask strength whiskey. It's aged for 15 years. And if we get in there, we won't get back out, because as human beings, we will not float in alcohol that's of that strength. We will sink right to the bottom, and we'll be forced to do what none of us want to do, is drink our way out of this Solera vat. So, you know, I think that could be fun, but sounds like a magical death. Exactly. I like your style, Jacqueline. Going out in style. So back to the Solera. It holds 10,000 gallons of 15-year-old whiskey. Massive. It's twice the size of this room that I'm in. No, it's about the size of this room I'm in. And it's about 10 feet tall. If you go to Glenfiddich, if you're planning on going to Scotland, let me know, and I'll set you up with a tour. Yeah, absolutely. We're already working on that for Vadim. When you get the tour, I mean, COVID rules hopefully are ending soon for the distillery tours. But when you get into, we set you up with the advanced tour, you get to go into warehouse 8, where the Solera vat, there only is one Solera vat for all of the Glenfiddich 15, and it's housed in warehouse number 8. So you get to see it, and if you're lucky, you get to potentially take a little sip out of it at cask strength, which is obviously.
And if you bring a bottle, can you bottle some too, or if no one's looking, or how does it work?
Actually, if you're quite sneaky, you might be able to get away with it. But in the distillery shop, they typically have a what do you call it? A cask with a handle that's directly pulling from a sample of that whiskey cask strength, so you can actually purchase it legit in the store, which is really nice. But it's fun to drink it straight from the vat.
And how often is the vat dumped and refilled? And like, obviously, it never gets to 0 because it's Solera. But
yeah,
how often do they cycle through it?
Yeah, the whole point of it is that it's filled and then it's never completely emptied. So the story is that it's never more than half emptied at any point. So when we're ready to bottle some new 15-year-old, we'll draw about half of it off, and then we'll top it up with a similar recipe. Excuse me. So half and half, and this will happen probably, I would say, on a weekly basis.
Like, how many bottles of 15 do you put out a year?
I'm not sure the exact number of that, but I can tell you that roughly, I believe it's about 70 to 75% of all the Glenfiddich sold is 12-year-old.
Wow.
So it is a relatively much lower number than that. But still, you know, we're selling a lot of Glenfiddich, so it's probably still a significant number of bottles. Someone can do the math. What's 10,000 litres? I mean, what was that? What was that? Plus, you've got to remember that's proof down. It's cask strength in the, so it's 10,000 litres of cask strength, 55, say 56%, and then it'll come down to 40 for bottling. So you're actually gaining quite a few bottles as you add the Robbie Dew spring water to it. Alex is thirsty, right? Yeah, less talk, more action. Is that what we're saying?
No, I was commenting on the drop to the distillery. Joke long, gone long.
Right, where are we going next? So, okay.
And someone had asked why we're skipping the 18, just to clarify. I think you and your lovely friends at Balvenie have been hit really hard with the shipping shortages. So the 18 is while it's a wonderful expression and we would have loved to have it tonight, impossible to find right now. So we're just waiting for it to blame the Port of Long Beach or something. I don't know. It's just impossible to find right now.
It's 18 specifically was a big problem for us, and we just got to the point in the last year where we stopped asking why, because it was a different reason every time we asked. But 18-year-old is coming back soon. We even, you know, we have Tullamore Dew Irish whiskey in our house, and we had to air freight Tullamore Dew for St. Patrick's Day to the States, and it barely made it. So it's been crazy. But 18 is a great example of when Glenfiddich starts to really come into a bit more kind of a grown-up, complex. It's moving away from the lighter. It's going into a little bit more of a heavier whiskey, even though it's still, relatively speaking, quite light. Glenn Gooley on Archer.
Yeah, the 18 is actually, the bottle is what they use on Archer there's a scotch on the show Archer called Glenn Gooley, and the bottle is based on the Glenfiddich 18.
That's awesome.
Can you just, you don't have it here, but you just like, what's the difference between the 18 in terms of, you know?
So if you look at Glenfiddich 12, 15, and 18 and 30-year-olds, right? 12, 15, 18, and 30.
Yeah.
Those are kind of a family within a family. You know, you've got the 14, the 21, all these different variations that we're gonna talk on some of them in a minute. 12, 15, 18, 30, same family, all a very similar style. Okay, the 15-year-old has a Solera, but forget that for a second. They're all bourbon and sherry cask only, right? So when you take the 12 all the way up to the 30-year-old, you're going up in age, you're going up in price, of course, and you're also going up in sherry cask content. So 12-year-old, about 15% sherry cask. All the way up to 30, you're now about 30% sherry cask. So not only are you getting a variation of flavor and complexity with the age, but you're also adding in a slightly different ratio of the barrels, the type of oak. So that's why this is a really good example. If you taste all those side by side, back to back, it's a really good example of why age is not the number one factor in whiskey. Right? It's a factor, it's an important one, but the casks that you use are very important. The strength of the whiskey is very important, right? So all these different things come into play. So we're jumping. So 12 will be lighter, fruity, vanilla, a little creamy. 15 has a little bit more spice, a little bit more complexity because you're adding more sherry cask, a little bit of new oak as well. And for some reason, this Solera process just seems to work really well because the 15 is just so well balanced. And then the 18 is going to be my whiskey for a cold night or for with a cigar. It's a bit more flavor, it's a bit longer finish, just has a little bit more oomph to it. It's also 43% versus the 40 for the 12 and the 15. So that's always going to add a little bit more character to your whiskey. Yep, that's the 18. It's actually Brian Kinsman's go-to. It's his favorite from the Glenfiddich range.
I can't find the 30, but I can find the 40. So if anyone's interested, I'm going to share the link if anybody wants to grab a bottle or two.
The 30 is excellent. The 40 is almost, I would say, life-changing. If you haven't really tasted something of that level, it is exquisite. It's very expensive, relatively speaking, but really an unbelievable whiskey. People ask me like, why? What's so special about it? It's like, well, okay, it's 40 years old, but there's something about the depth of flavor that you get with a whiskey like that. That you sip it and you can leave the glass for 10 minutes, you can still taste it. It's evolving and it's changing. It's just a great, really interesting experience. Would we like to move on to the 21?
We'd love to.
Excellent.
So the one that we used for this one was the Chinese New Year special Zodiac one. It's the same exact juice as the regular 21. It's just a pretty box, right?
Yep. This is also a pretty box.
Oh, absolutely.
And it opens all the way.
Ooh. Everyone should unmute and say, ooh.
New poll for favorite box.
Ooh.
Um, 21-year-old. So this is one of my favorites for a few reasons. One of them you're not going to like. I actually am quite partial to messing around with whiskies and cocktails. We'll get to that in a second. So this is a rum cask finish. Any rum fans? Well,
You gotta say it depends on the rum because rums are so
actually,
different.
let me grab something.
Oh, Frank and Neil are splitting a bottle. I can only afford to look at it. I can't afford to chip in.
So back when we first came out with this, it was in 2001 and it was called Havana Reserve. Okay, 21-year-old rum cask, Havana Reserve. This bottle has long been dry. And basically what happened was the same way that we bring bourbon barrels from the US, we bring sherry casks from Spain. We originally would have brought rum barrels from Cuba and then eventually from the Caribbean, but for obvious reasons, we had to stop using Cuban rum barrels if we wanted to sell it to the US. So this kind of fell away very quickly around about 2002. And we switched it up into the Grand Reserva, 21-year-old Caribbean rum cask finish. And that's this bottle that we're dealing with today.
So the embargo actually affects what cask you finish in? That's crazy.
Yeah, I believe so.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what I was told, at least. Basically, we switched to the Caribbean rum barrels. We found out that those barrels were being used, right? Well, the barrels have only got so much life in them before everything's been extracted out of the oak. So we were getting these barrels shipped over to Scotland. We're putting whiskey in there. It was having no effect. They were just dormant. So it was a waste of time, a waste of money, and it was really frustrating. So what we started to do, per David Stewart's request or direction, was to bring rum barrels bring rum from the Caribbean and bring it to Scotland and then season the barrels with the rum on site ourselves. So we've been doing that this way since the early 2000s now. Something a little bit different, a little bit of a longer lead time to get it done, but very interesting whiskey as a result. So yeah, some notes coming through there, warm spice notes, caramelized fruit. Tasting notes on the bottle, we'll talk about like toffee, vanilla, fudge, and what's the other one? Fig. I mean, who eats figs? Figs are delicious, but I mean, who really eats them? I'm sure someone in here is going to say I eat them all the time. There's 4 hands went up there.
I have a tree.
We're-
I have to eat them.
I was gonna say, we're in California, they grow here.
They're yeah.
Cool.
Bring
I
some
need to get some friends that have fig trees.
That's why I get them, because Jackie gives them to me.
They're really good with jalapenos and bacon.
Goes with what?
Jalapenos, you stuff them with cream cheese, then stuff that in a jalapeno, then wrap that in bacon.
I've
Is
had
that
all
like
of
a
that
turducken
except with
with
the fig in it.
What isn't good with bacon though?
Yeah, I mean, it fixes most of life's problems.
So the fig, like the thing I get with this whiskey is it's very soft up front, but then as it settles in, you get this little kind of a spice, kind of just tickles you a little bit. So you think it's going to be soft and very kind of uneventful, and then it just kind of comes to life a little bit, and it's really quite sexy and easygoing. I like to put this in a daiquiri. You know, don't spit your whiskey out. Classic daiquiri is just basically typically around about 2 ounces of your spirit, so usually a rum, and then we'll do 3/4 ounce of the fresh lime juice and 3/4 ounce of the simple syrup. We shake that up on ice and we put it into a chilled coupe glass. It is extraordinarily luxurious, extraordinarily expensive, but one of the finest cocktails I've ever had in my life, and it's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. I don't expect anyone on this call to accept or condone that behavior.
I'll take 2.
You take 2, okay. If I'm paying, right? That tends to be how it works. I made a joke on another video where I was like, someone said, "Oh, that's an expensive daiquiri," and I was like, "Oh, well, if the brand's paying, who cares?" So, well, let's have a little taste, shall we? Sanjava, cheers, and up yours.
I'm sorry, but this one so far has just blown me away. The fruit salad on this is just, oh my God, so good.
Yeah.
I just wish it wasn't $300 or $250 or whatever.
Yeah. It's, you know, these whiskies are just getting more expensive all the time because there's more and more people getting into it, and there's a finite supply, right? Especially of the age stuff. So unfortunately, that's just the way it goes. But still, for a whiskey of 21 years of age, it's not quite at the ridiculous point yet. The first time I ever tried a daiquiri with a 21-year-old, it was a $48 cocktail, and that was for lunch on a Tuesday afternoon in Austin, Texas. And that was a fun day. This works particularly well with a really nice creme brulee, or something similar. You know, something with a similar kind of flavor profile as a creme brulee really works well. Of course, if you're drinking 21-year-old Scotch, you're probably just having it on its own. Let's be honest here. Or dipping bacon in it, you know, if you're frank, I guess.
Is the finish on this one actually shorter, or is it because it's such a big initial hit that it just feels like it's shorter?
No, I think it's shorter. I would agree with that. It's quite interesting when we taste the 18, which we didn't do tonight, obviously, but when you taste the 18 and then go to 21 for some people can be a little bit of a letdown because the 18 has so much complexity and has a really long warming finish that when you get to 21, you're kind of like, it kind of took a step backwards in terms of intensity. But I find that a lot of people love that as well. You know, they love the softness of it, and it's like you can feel what the aging has done to it. It's kind of softened up some of the slightly sharper edges, and it just becomes this really dangerously easy drinking whiskey. So different courses for horses, I guess.
You know, I have a note from the last time I tasted some Glenfiddich, and so I have a question about the 15-year. Well, it's a Solera vat, and it's been a Solera vat since the 90s. Is that what you said?
Yes, 98, yeah.
So basically, if I tasted something different last time, it was probably on me, because there shouldn't be major differences between the last 15, which is only a year or two ago, and this 15. Okay.
Right. The idea behind the VAT is consistency.
Exactly. So it's interesting. I have a really different. I mean, I tasted like smoke and peat in the last version I had.
Okay.
Which didn't make any sense.
Well, so technically, there would have been no peat, right? But you know, phenols come from oak as well, So it's not beyond the realms that you could pick a little bit up if you were particularly sensitive that day.
Yeah.
It does also happen on occasion that the products are not exactly the same as they are intended, because humans, right? I mean, there's a huge human element in how these whiskies are produced. There's some automation at certain parts of the process, but in terms of blending the batches together, that's done by a human element.
Right.
So it has happened on occasion. And then you've also got the variation of perhaps a bottle that's been open for a while versus a bottle that's just been freshly opened. You know, that definitely can have an effect. And then probably the biggest one and the most likely one is what you had to eat or drink before.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, like I said, I think it was on me that I must have tasted.
Yeah.
I must have eaten something different. Okay.
Yeah, we were sat in New York one night having a dram of the 21-year-old Glenfiddich with Brian and a few of the folks that work for the distillery. And, you know, we're just chatting. No one's sitting nosing, and we're just drinking. You know, we're just having a good time. We're not assessing the whiskey. But I was pretty new at the time. I was maybe a year or two in the job. And I just happened to catch a whiff of smoke on the whiskey. And I thought, before I say anything to the server, I asked around the table, does anyone else pick up a little bit of peat smoke on this whiskey? And everyone kind of stopped what they're doing, had a sniff of like, oh yeah, a little bit. And then we started to all notice it and agree that it was there. And so we asked the server if they could bring the bottle. Sure enough, they bring the bottle. Yeah, peat on the 21. Sure enough, she brings the bottle and we could taste it. And this has happened to me on more than one occasion. So I don't know if it's just a case of something you've had to eat that day that's affecting you, or if something happened with that batch that was just ever so slightly different. We will never know.
Yeah.
But the reality is that at Glenfiddich, we run our spirit 51 weeks of the year using a very similar style of non-peated barley, right? So we're producing the same type of spirit day in, day out, as close as the same thing as we can get. And that spirit goes into casks and becomes whatever one of these whiskies. But for 1 week out of the year, we switch up the barley that we use and we bring in a barley that's slightly peated. And this was introduced by my mentor back in the day, Ian Miller. He decided or suggested that we should try this. And then it wasn't to create one specific Glenfiddich, it was just to create another element for your spice rack, if you like, another type of whiskey or spirit that we could age and then potentially use for a limited edition or something, which we've done on a few occasions. There's a few Glenfiddich expressions that are peated that are out there. Very hard to find them now, but the most recent one was the Fire and Cane, which if you can still find that, actually, I found that in a number of stores in LA not too long ago. So that's a slightly peated Glenfiddich using some of that stock that's made only once a year. So was there cross-contamination? Who knows?
I remember when we did our Balvenie tasting, they mentioned that when they do peat week, it's always right before the annual cleaning of the stills because they don't want to cross-contaminate the rest of it.
It's the same. It's a convenient time to do that. So yeah, 21, interesting. 23 has a whisper of smoke. All right, so Brian's.
It's funny, my wife said the same thing. That's a beautiful bottle. When did that come out? That was 2020, right? Or 2019, end of 2019?
The end of 2019, we launched this out in the US.
Gorgeous.
Really sexy, triangular bottle, just like everything else, but this one's a little bit more pronounced. Really
What's
great.
the story with the triangular bottle?
Great for pouring. Something that was just kind of introduced by, are you familiar with the artwork of the London Underground? The white circle with the red stripe through it? Quite an iconic design. That was produced by an artist, Hans Schläger. I believe he was Austrian, I think. And so he was called into the distillery to create a unique shaped bottle. And he came up with something that was more pronounced, than the 15-year-old nowadays. You can still see it, of course, but this is it's a bit of a sharper design here. But it was originally the theory behind it was to represent the trinity of whiskey making, water, air, and barley. It wouldn't have been yeast, but they said water, air, and barley. It looks cool. It's different. You know, Johnny Walker's got the slanted label. You can see it at a glance in a bar. Very good marketing. Good idea. Triangular bottle. I guess trying to kind of create that little bit of originality and something a little bit more identifiable. And then, of course, some people will make up whatever anecdote they feel like at the time. Like, you know, it's so that when you slam the brakes on your truck, it doesn't roll out from under your seat. You know, that was in Texas. I heard that one when I used to live there. Any Texans in? No Texans here? Alex liked that one though. John and Brian and Shane, I haven't seen from you guys. Are you guys taking part in the tasting? Or are you just eavesdropping? Here we go. Oh, we have seen Shane. Shane was on earlier. So was John.
It's a good time to bring everybody back as we pour our 23.
Exactly.
Get Brian Seitz to come back, and we can do our customary little raise the glass and toast.
Okay, looking at some notes here.
So I do want to say, sorry about that. I just want to say thank you to everyone for spending the evening with us. And Dave, thank you so much for organizing this for us. This has been not over yet, but thank you. This is delicious liquid and fantastic brand, and we're happy to finally meet you. So cheers to you.
Right. Thank you. Cheers, guys, and pleasure to be here with you.
Perfect. Got it.
I only just moved to the area. I'm in Glendale, actually. I just moved here in December from Austin, Texas.
I was born and raised in Glendale.
I was gonna say we're in Glendale. There's a few of us in this area.
We're in Glendale too. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Hey, yay.
Neighbors, hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might end up getting some homegrown figs after all.
Yes,
I was
you're
gonna
right.
say mulberries too. Those are coming.
Oh, the mulberries. Oh,
Oh, this is excellent news. Amazing how everyone was like making fun of me for moving to Glendale. And it's like everyone's in Glendale. All the people that matter.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Glendale.
Yeah.
Wasn't born there, but raised.
I'm your neighbor in Altadena.
Excellent.
Pasadena.
yeah.
Love
See,
about
that's
Pasadena
we're
as
all
well.
in the area, and we all have fruit. You know.
Got a great hat. I should have worn it tonight. It says I'd rather be in Glendale.
Yeah, come over in 2 months. We'll have figs. 2-3 months. Yeah.
Mine are August, I think.
August. Yeah.
Yeah.
Vadim set this up.
My loquats will be ready soon.
Yours should be like my dad's are popping.
Yeah,
They're already going. I've already
just
started
about.
eating them.
Love it.
I've been known to make my rounds to Amanda's and to whoever else has fruit. Just spend a weekend cherry picking, so to say.
I
Cherry
remember
picking, yeah, good.
years ago we came back. We were actually on a family holiday to Florida from Scotland, and we had gooseberries in the back. And our neighbour, who we never spoke to ever, she had come across, and I guess my mom caught her in the act, stealing the gooseberries as we were walking back in the door with our suitcases.
It happens. It happens a lot around here. I find people under my mulberry tree all the time.
Hey, Kiki, the Glendale mulberry thieves.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to find them in stores because they bruise.
Oh.
That and loquats, you can never find them. So I'm
Unless you're in
guilty.
Glendale, they're in every house in Glendale.
And most people don't eat them. So I'm like, if I
No,
walk by a
they
house,
all in my neighborhood. They all eat them because it's all the Persian Armenians eat them.
My problem is my tree is huge and it gives so much fruit.
Back my neighbor has a loquat tree that hangs over our backyard. Vadim, you're welcome to come over and go crazy.
I will actually take you up on that. You know me and loquats.
You
But
send
yeah,
them my
back to this
way, they'll
Glenfiddich.
get jammed.
Being recorded.
Yeah.
Amanda's tree is bursting, so.
Amanda said, send them my way. I'll jam them.
So
Dry them for me. I like them when you dry it.
Brian was looking for an empty bottle of 18.
I have a bottle of 18, but not an empty bottle to make my Glengoolie version. But
that would be awesome. We'll need
So
to
are
get-
we on the 23 now? Is that what we're tasting?
Yeah, so yeah, we poured the 23. Okay, so Glenfiddich Grand Cru. We just drank the Grand Reserva 21. This is the 23, which is the second in the grand range. The third is something that we weren't able to get for tonight, but it's the Grand Couronne, which is a cognac cask finish, 26-year-old. But tonight, the black and gold is the Grand Cru, the 23-year-old. And this is something that was released in 2019, right before we all kind of disappeared for a bit of time. So we launched this in Houston, LA, New York. And we've stolen inspiration for the 14-year-old with the American whiskey, the bourbon world. We've stolen inspiration here for the 23-year-old Grand Cru from the champagne world. Now, in marketing, we've got to be very careful about using the word champagne. We're not allowed to use it at all. Excuse me. But the Grand Cru, the name, is taken from the champagne world. What we've done is we've partnered with some a select few champagne producers that actually do use some French oak to age their wines slightly, you know, for a few weeks. And then we take those French oak barrels after they've held the wine for a few weeks and we bring them over to Scotland. We take 23-year-old Glenfiddich, which is bourbon barrel and sherry cask married together, mostly bourbon casks. And then we take that marriage and we place it into those French oak barrels for the last few months, 3 months or so. So interested to hear what you think. On the nose, it's got something a little bit different. I pick up a little bit of a, it's almost like baklava to me. Every time I pick it up, it's something different. Sometimes it's donuts. Sometimes it's something baked.
It's some kind of dessert pastry.
Yeah, pastry. Mixed in with the fruit. So I would say probably a little bit of pear, classic Glenfiddich.
Yeah, I get pear and donuts.
Pear and donuts.
Or pear donuts.
That's what people call me and my buddies, like a pair of donuts.
I was gonna say a little bit of a apple fritter, which I guess kind of goes with that. But
this one's got something different to it, right? The tropical fruits are coming back out now.
Yeah, and where the 21 kind of dropped off, this thing actually increases in intensity the longer it sits there.
It's a little soft up front, right? But then it kind of just ramps up the flavor as it goes and settles in. Really nice. Something a little bit unusual. We learned that most champagne producers are not using oak because they're scared to overpower their delicate wines. So they typically use steel vats to do the first fermentation rather than oak. And then, of course, it's not actually champagne until that wine is fermented for the second time in the bottle. So even if we were to try and use the word champagne, we wouldn't really be accurate, you know, because the wine casks that we're getting are used in the production process of champagne, but the wine that was in there was not yet actually champagne. The same way that if you were to take a 2-year-old cask of Scotch whiskey, you couldn't bottle it and call it Scotch whiskey until it's 3 years old, right? So it hasn't met the criteria for it to be named champagne. A hint of smoke in the finish. There's a lot going on here. There's a woodiness to it. There's a dryness to it at the end, but up front, a lot of fruit, a lot of. Sometimes I don't know if it's just the idea of the power of suggestion, because you know we start talking about sparkling wines and champagnes, but sometimes people do pick up a little bit of a vibrancy on it, as if it is effervescent, but obviously it's not a fizzy whiskey. But sometimes that can come into the tasting notes. Favorite expression of the night? Oh, well.
You know, it's funny that you said that about the effervescence, because I was just thinking, just as you were saying that, I was just thinking, you know, I got this little playfulness on my tongue, you know, and that's like the bubbles in champagne. They give you that little playfulness on the tongue. So I guess I can understand why some people would say they can see the champagne, but you can get that with anything. You don't have to have the bubbles in champagne.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting when we released this whiskey, or right in the lead up to it, we started to, we went to France and we went to Cognac, and we were supposed to go to Champagne. We never made it for whatever reason, but we got a champagne tasting from the ambassador from Krug. And at the time, like, I'd only ever really tasted champagne on occasions when it was usually Moet and it was usually something really dry. And I didn't really have a great, love for champagne until we met Mr. Krug, or the guy who worked for Krug, and it just blew me away. Like, and these were expensive wines we were drinking, but buttery and sweet, complex. Some of them were a little drier than others, but it wasn't just this big punch of dryness and bubbles. So I've really developed another expensive habit in champagne through that trip.
And the biggest problem with champagne is once you crack the bottle, you got to finish it.
That's it. I mean, it is a problem.
That's the biggest issue. And good champagne like starts at $50. So I'd rather spend 300 on a 23-year-old Scotch and sip it for a year than drop 50 and be done that night.
So it's a great point. Although I don't believe that Vadim's got any bottles that have lasted a year.
You'd be surprised, actually.
I'm sure you've got quite a few bottles in your collection, though.
I definitely don't have nearly as much as some of the people in this room.
Who's got the biggest collection, do we think?
Fortman. Frank probably has a nice collection.
Wait, what was that? Sorry.
Biggest collection in the room.
Oh, yeah. Wine, whiskey, both? What are we talking?
Oh, whiskey first.
Whiskey first. What do you like, 4,000?
No, but I'm not saying when we're being recorded.
Wow, good man. Right.
And I have his address, so if anybody wants, it's available.
But I do have
for
a
the
good
right price.
selection of cast strength independent bottlings of Fitting, so I'll tell you that.
Really?
Yeah. And an 18 in the cupboard.
Are they actually labeled as Glenfiddich or are they all teaspoon?
I don't know. They're I'm not even going to say because you're going to give me a hard time. I was going to say they're not up here open, but I don't know. They're like I was looking like Hector something or other.
So Hector Macbeth is
Hector
the
Macbeth
teaspoon version. Yeah.
Right. Hector Macbeth, 20-year-old. Hector Macbeth, 21-year-old. Hepburn's Choice. Hector Macbeth, 23-year-old. Yep.
So Dave, I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about the whole teaspooning and that whole aspect of it. I mean, we can pause the recording if you want to, or if you want to chat about it. I know Glenfiddich is one of those brands that doesn't really have name recognized, like that doesn't have their name on independently bottled bottles.
Yeah.
So, and that's pretty unique in the industry, right? I think that's definitely a Balvenie and Glenfiddich trait.
Yeah, I mean, that's a decision from the family. So Glenfiddich was started in 1887 by William Grant, and William Grant's we're now in fifth generation ownership of the family. The Grant family still owns and operates independently the company. So they have ultimate say in what can go out and what can be labeled, etc., etc. And we do produce whiskey for other companies and other brands, but like you said, we don't allow them to say where it comes from. So there's a hell of a lot of Glenfiddich flying around there and other products that we don't know what it is, and some of them we do. There's was it Wardhead is one of them with Balvenie and Glenfiddich. Teaspooning, for anyone that's not familiar, is single malt Scotch whiskey is a product of one distillery, single distillery. That's the single and single malt stands for that one single distillery. So even though we have two distilleries in our one house, if we were to mix some Balvenie with some Glenfiddich, we can't call it a single malt. It's still a malt whiskey, but it now legally it has to be termed a vatted malt. So when you have one or more single malts together, it's a vatted malt. Back in the days, it would have been called it's a blended malt. It used to be called a vatted malt. They changed the name to blended malt. So for example, we've got another whiskey in the market called Monkey Shoulder, which was brought in maybe 7-8 years ago and was famous for being spoken of as being a blend of Glenfiddich, Balvenie, and one of our other whiskies, Kinninvie. It's not the case anymore, but that's a blended. No, they basically said we can't say that because that's not guaranteed. Essentially, they have a profile for that whiskey, and it'll be a blend of at least two different malts to get to that profile. They didn't want the story to be talking about Glenfiddich and Balvenie. They wanted the story to be Monkey Shoulder, which Monkey Shoulder was a repetitive strain injury that the maltmen would get as they were turning the barley to help it dry. And of course, the guys, health and safety in the UK won't allow that anymore. It's done by machinery. But that was a little story that it was the naming convention for Monkey Shoulder.
That was my go-to scotch when I was getting into whiskey, because the bottle I really wanted was a Balvenie 12, but that was $50, and I can get Monkey Shoulder for 30 at Trader Joe's all day long. So that was like the poor man's Balvenie.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Yeah, so yeah, the independent bottlers, you know, teaspooning is essentially taking a tiny bit of one distillery of their liquid, putting it into a cask of another. So, for example, you could take a teaspoon of Balvenie into a cask of Glenfiddich. Now that you've mixed them, you legally cannot call it single malt. So it's a technique that's done for that reason. And so you can't specifically say this is a cask of Glenfiddich, because it's a cask of 2 malt whiskies now. So it is no longer one specific product.
And that was a really good hack to do when the tariffs were in place. I know a lot of those came to market when there was a tariff on the 30% tariffs on single malts. As soon as it's all blended, so it's as close to a single malt as you can get, but you don't have to pay 30% on it.
So my guess is that that would have been grain whiskey that was added. So if you take 2 malt whiskies and mix them, it's a blended malt, which I don't know if the tariffs identified blended malts differently.
Yeah, it was single malt only that hit the tariffs.
Okay, so blended malt did not come into the tariffs?
So yeah, it wasn't tariffs. It wasn't taxed. The blended malts were not taxed. It was single malt only that was taxed.
Wow, that's
because our lawmakers don't know the difference.
Yeah, because even the Irish, it was just single malt out of Northern Ireland.
interesting. Which, you know, if you look at the global market of Scotch whisky sales, I think it's closer to 85 to 90% of the Scotch whisky sold is blended. Not blended malt, but blended Scotch, you know, like grain whisky and malt whisky together, like Johnny Walker, Chivas, Grants, which I think is pretty similar in the US in terms of the split of how it's sold. It's mostly blended Scotch that's sold here. So, but the interesting thing about those tariffs, you know, those tariffs came in and they never went away. Well, the tariffs went away, but the price increase never went away.
Yep.
So that tends to be how it goes.
Gosh, I still get that whiff of smoke on the back end of this 23. It's insane.
So
I don't remember. I mean, I've only ever tasted it once before, and I don't remember having it then, but it's been a few years.
Why do independent bottlers exist at all? Do the source distilleries not have the capability to bottle Allardice? It's just another business, right? It's like, hey, most independent bottlers don't make whiskey. They're blenders. Think of Compass Box, one of the most famous ones. They have a whole host of different products now, but they started as taking other whiskies that existed and blending them to their own spec. So it's just a different approach than being a producer. Of course, they can produce if they have all those things in place, but it also gives brands an easy way of offloading whiskey for profit, right? Like you can just sell full barrels rather than bottling it, marketing it, labeling it. They can sell full barrels to a producer that wants to do something else with it.
Especially if it's like a little bit off profile.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because like what you were talking about with the Monkey Shoulder, you know, Monkey Shoulder has a flavor profile. Balvenie 12 has a flavor. Glenfiddich 12 has a flavor. And you get some amazing casks out of there, but they don't fit that flavor profile. And
Right.
so, you know, what else are you going to do with it? Well, you can try and hide it in a massive batch, but some of those are actually can throw an entire batch off.
Yeah, it's true that they make jokes about certain casks that will be sold to other companies. But one thing's for sure, whiskey in Scotland will never be poured down the drain. It will always go into something. But Demon's pulling something out here.
I don't know if you want to talk about this one. This is the add-on, the optional. Were you able to get a bottle?
I forgot about it, to be honest. I looked back at my notes and I was like, oh, this is what we're doing. I forgot that was a separate thread. We'll need to pick up a bottle later. you guys enjoy.
Let me let's do so we did a poll real quick, and and we talked about everyone voted for their favorite expression of the night. You want to take a guess of what the favorite one tonight was?
My guess would be 23 or 20, actually 21.
All right, let me share the results. You had it right the first time, but
Never
yeah, you're
second guess yourself.
pretty close.
Yeah, honestly, I was close to putting 15, but I put 23.
And you were pretty close with all of those.
Yeah. See, poor old 14 and 12. No love.
Yeah, but I think every single one has been fantastic. So
Look, that says a lot for the 15-year-old, don't you think?
yeah, absolutely.
Neck and neck with the 21 in the poll, and okay, the 23-year-old, unsurprisingly, is out ahead, 45%, almost half the room. But the 15-year-old really is amazing bang for buck. So, it's what, $65 a bottle maybe.
I'm curious about the experimental series, the IPA and the 20.
We had 4 releases. They truly were unusual. So the first one was a partnership with a brewery in Speyside. We partnered with them to get their IPA to put into our barrels. Basically what he wanted barrels to age as beer. And we said, cool, we could do something with that with you, but we want some of your beer so that we can mess around with it. So essentially made an overhopped IPA, put it into barrel, used bourbon barrels for, I believe it was 4 to 6 weeks, I believe. The beer comes out, it was undrinkable before it went in. I mean, it was not a nice beer. It wasn't intended to be, but after the experimentation, they realized that they had to go over the top with the hops, put that into barrel for 4 to 6 weeks. Beer comes out, beer's now drinkable, right? Great fun. And then we've got these barrels that are seasoned with the IPA. Put Glenfiddich, it was an unmarked age. So my guess is it was probably a 9-year-old or something like that, 10-year-old. And that then went into those casks for another 3 months. So that was the IPA. That was the first experiment. Project 20 was 20 of us brand ambassadors went to the distillery. We were given a piece of chalk. We were taken into warehouse number 2. Said, mark 6 barrels of your choice. Only rule is, if it's been marked already, you can't mark it. Right? So we put our initials on 6 barrels, kind of at random. And then the next day, we were given those samples each of our 6 samples to determine which were our favorites. And the favorites were then put into the final blend of Project 20. That was designed and, the ratio was decided by Brian Kinsman. So that ended up being bottled at 47% ABV and non-chill filter because we said, look, we are brand ambassadors. We're out there talking to the whiskey geeks of the world. We can't just go with another 40% ABV. We got to go something higher, something non-chill filtered preferably. And they listened and we got that. So it was ended up being whiskies from 6 years old to about 19 or 20 years old. 17 bourbon barrels, 2 sherry butts, and 1 port pipe. My whiskey was a 7-year-old bourbon barrel. I just liked it because it was just cool that it was such a flavorful, nice whiskey at such a young age. I just chose that. Third one, Winter Storm, 21-year-old, finished in ice wine casks from Canada. Really tasty, really interested. Comes in a white box. If you ever find it, it's probably going to be massively overpriced, but really cool whiskey. Trying to think of somewhere that has it. There's a place in Dallas that had it. They had bought tons of bottles of it. I kept going in there to try and finish the bottle, and they kept bringing new ones out. Number 4 was the Fire and Cane. That's still around, and that's a easy one to find in terms. Well, it's an easy one to track down in terms of price. It's like $50-60, if that. That was a slightly peated Glenfiddich that was finished in a rum barrel. Really quite cool. If you like peated whiskey, it's not going to punch you in the face like some of the Islays, but a really nice little smoky character there. So what is Brian showing off down there? Is that IB?
This is the Hepburn's Choice. It's the only
Oh,
one
yeah.
that I had easily, which is a relative term because it wasn't so easy, but 23 years, bottled in 2020, 658 bottles, tasting notes, brown sugar, dark chocolate, golden syrup, 53.8%. So, but it doesn't say Glenfiddich. It just says Hector Macbeth.
Right.
I don't know
So-
if you can see it in the.
Yeah.
Well, if we're talking about those, the one a lot of the people have in their hand tonight
21.
is 1997 Hector Macbeth by the first editions.
Oh.
And that one's bottled at 53.7.
Just missed it.
It's quite delicious. Bottled in 2018. Yep.
So is it better than the others? For those of us that
No, it's different. I mean, I really enjoyed the 21 year. That was absolutely fantastic. I didn't get to vote. Oh, let me stop sharing the poll. But yeah, the 21-year-old in the poll got 5 votes versus the 15 and the 20. The 23 got 5 votes and the 15 and the 21 got 3 votes. So essentially neck and neck. All this stuff is really good. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The fact that the 15 held its own against those two kind of beautiful stallions is pretty impressive.
If we were both voting, the 23 would have gotten 1 extra vote, just so you know. It wouldn't
So
have changed. Wouldn't have changed the outcome.
It was a runaway victory for the 23.
Mhm.
It'd be
But
interesting to
I
do.
picked 15.
It'd be interesting to do the same tasting blind, right, and see what where we would come out, because I would be pretty certain it would not come out the same way. Because there's a lot of bias plays into this, and it's like dessert, right? You know, like we're all look forward to dessert. So the same with the older whiskey at the end. We kind of tend to, you guys have your own palates. Absolutely, could be your favorite in a blind, but quite often we just expect it to be the best, and we build it up in our heads that it might be. But you know, there is certain whiskies when you get to, you know, like for example, a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old, they're unmistakable. You could taste those blind all day and you would know that they were something special.
I thought the 21 was rum forward, so it threw me off, and it was very nice. Don't get me wrong, but in terms of Scotch, I felt like it wasn't just that the rum cask gave it an interesting something. It felt like the rum cask was forward on that.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear that. I've never actually heard anyone say that for that particular one, but I'm quite sensitive to rum because I don't really drink rum, to be honest.
Not anymore.
Not
since your Coke and rum days, right?
Oh well, yeah, for sure.
Here.
But we went to. I was on vacation with my dad, and we decided he was on a rum kick at the time, and he decided we were going to taste some rums that day. And the only rums that I liked were the ones that had sugar added to them. Like I think it was El Dorado was one of them. But when I found out, I feel like the ones that I liked were the ones that had sugar added. I just wasn't a big fan of them. But yeah, the 21-year-old, I feel like I've had other whiskies in the past that were some sort of finish, and I thought the same, where it'd been kind of a little bit more dominated by the finish. So but it's interesting to hear all the different thoughts on this.
I was going to ask you, can you, I don't know if this is an unfair question to ask, but can you speak to the duty-free exclusives? Because I know Glenfiddich is pretty well known for having, pretty much always having something exclusive duty-free available. And it's usually non-age stated. It's like the select cask or whatever. Are those worth chasing, or there's just like a airport gimmick?
So a lot of the airport stuff nowadays I find to be just kind of run of the mill, fill the shelf. And we've got a select barrel, there's two, I always butcher the names, but there's actually 3, but the first 2, the youngest 2, they're like 14 years or under. One of them's a sherry cask and a bourbon cask, and one of them I think has some sort of a wine cask. But the third
Looks
one,
like select, reserve, and vintage.
thank you. So vintage, the third one, the oldest one, which is closer to 17, 18 years, is 100% worth getting, in my opinion. It's a peated Glenfiddich, and it's a really rounded, well-balanced whiskey. It has the smoke, but again, there's other flavors that come through, not just the smoke. It is wonderful, and I actually think I'm out of it. So the next time I travel, I need to remember to pick some up. But that is well worth it. I think it's like maybe 70, 80 pounds, or maybe closer to 100. I'm not sure. Really worth getting, yeah. But the other 2, they're good, but they're not. I wouldn't go chasing them down, to be honest. Balveni's got my cousin has just recently got. He's older than me, but he just recently got into Scotch, which I think his wife is hating because it's quite an expensive habit to pick up. But he was traveling through somewhere in Europe, and he found a bottle of the Balvenie 16 triple cask for the equivalent of £50, which I think was like
cheap. That's free.
I thought it was a mistake. I was like, "Are you sure it's the triple cask 16?" Maybe he's had a few drams and it was just a 12-year-old. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are some good things out there at duty free, but nowadays it's harder and harder to find really interest. I always have kind of for the most part, I kind of have a rule that if the whiskey has a story attached to it, I'm not interested.
Discovery series.
Yeah, I mean, now the Discovery series was good. I just didn't like the story. But quite often, if it's a story-led whiskey, now those had an age statement. Those were 19-year-old, so you had some sort of a statement, of some sort of maturation. But a lot of the story-led whiskies that are no age statement, you're like, really? We're literally scraping the barrel for some sort of a marketing angle here. It used to be that you could just slap an age on it and call it a day, but now if you don't put an age on it, you've got to come up with a fancy story. And some of them are great stories, but most of them are just beware. Could be a pig with lipstick.
I will say, if you insist on doing a recap of this, I could be convinced. This is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I actually think just for laughs, we could do different whiskies, right? But to do it blind, I think could be quite fun. Just to do the poll at the end, just to kind of make it might not change anything for you, but it might change your perception of what your brain is telling.
Next time we have you on, you and I will know the lineup, but we'll do it blind for everyone. And
yeah, is it like, is your palate leading your decision, or is it your brain, right? Or a mixture of the two? Glendale is basically a foreign territory, so there should be some rare duty-free bottles there, right? Oh,
that's funny.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a European site and I see a Glenfiddich Grand Cortez 22-year-old.
Yeah, I haven't even had that yet. That's only available in China or Taiwan, or both.
Oh, Whiskey World has it. I've shared the link.
If anyone ever goes to Taiwan, remember
They also have like different versions. They had like the Solera, but it's called the very, very old or something.
Yes.
No, it's just an old bottling, the Solera. That's all. It's not a different version. It's just an old bottling.
There is a really old Glenfiddich that's called Solera something. And it's, some of these whiskies are typically for specific Asian markets, sometimes specific European markets, but usually specific Asian markets. And there's the 22. There's a new Glenfiddich coming to the US September. It's a 12-year-old. It's going to be in a red package rather than the green, and it's going to be a Amontillado sherry cask finish. So I'm really looking forward to that. I believe it's going to be priced at the same price as the 14-year-old. Which will be interesting to see how that moves, right? Because people see a 12 versus a 14 for the same price. No, not the same price. I think $5 less. But that should be fun.
Are they going to do more of the experimentals like they did with the Project 20?
The current ones that I mentioned, I think they're all but discontinued. Maybe the Fire and Cane are still stock of. Maybe you can find a Project 20 in an IPA somewhere. But I think they're either discontinued or about to be discontinued. Is there a fifth one coming? Not sure. I haven't heard anything about that. I don't think so. I think that's
experimental cast strength would be quite something to consider. Just saying.
Well, we hopefully are getting back to the distillery. We usually go every June. All the ambassadors around the world get a conference. We go back and we'll pick up a few cast strength samples and we're there. Haven't been for a couple of years, so looking forward to hopefully go back this June. So I'll try to get my hands on quite a few cast strength samples so we can maybe have something fun to share with you guys at another time.
And I'll try to do that as well and not share with anyone.
That's fair. Have you done a tasting with Neil from the Balvenie?
We did, yeah, a couple of years ago though.
Okay, maybe we.
And every time I try to get him back in, he says, "I have no stock."
Yeah, well, that's an easy way of saying I don't want to work. But maybe he and I could do one together. That'd be fun.
Definitely, would love that.
I love the opportunity to drink some Balvenie.
We'll do that one as the blind one. See who wins.
Yeah,
that'd be fun.
To get a little political, so I know I spoke to a couple shop owners, and they said actually now that Russia is getting is basically sanctioned and not getting any of the scotch that they were otherwise going to get, there's more scotch for the rest of us that aren't invading other countries. So how has that affected, if at all, Glenfiddich, and what does that mean for maybe getting more Glenfiddich here in the States?
I mean, it's probably a real thing, right? And typically what happens, traditionally the US has often supplemented lack of sales in other markets, for different reasons. This is the biggest market. The US market represents 30% of our business globally. So it's a big deal. So quite often
30% of that is in this room.
Yeah. So quite often if there's surplus from some other market, that it will find its way to the US. But there's no telling what's going to happen with stuff like that right now, because the shipping's such a disaster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think us not having a stock is not a stock issue, it's a shipping issue.
Yeah, there was problems at one time with cork, with glass bottles, excuse me. Shipping was obviously a big one, but there's a whole host of different things. And then, there's the transportation of just trucks, right? That was a huge one as well. Shortage of everything. But clearly no shortage of appetite for drinking it.
Yeah.
That's true. But look,
well, this is great because I know Glenfiddich I always think of as sort of like an old time original scotch. Yep. There's so many newer ones. I don't know if that's true, but I always think of that Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, like some of the, like they say in Swingers, the Glens. And it's nice to revisit them even at this ridiculously low proof because they taste so good. So thank you for doing this tasting.
No, I'm with you. We ask these questions all the time, and it's essentially, pretty much every company is just trying to get as much profit as possible, right? I mean, it's really great that the smaller independent bottlers don't play that game as much, and I think that's a great thing for them. But when you're talking about the vast majority of people that drink our whiskey, they don't know anything about the strength of the whiskey. They have no clue. I mean, literally 99.5% of people that drink our whiskey, they couldn't tell you what a cask strength whiskey is. They don't know. So for us,
trying to decide it's too strong.
Because probably because we're in front of people like you on a regular basis, and in front of bartenders, and in front of collectors. We get those conversations in a very regular basis. But when we have to zoom out and understand the business, it's like, I get why they do it. It's like, we can make still a good product, but we can make way more of it and satisfy many more markets versus if we make it all at cask strength.
Right.
To satisfy the 1% of our drinking audience. But there should be more of a happy medium, right? We should have something that satisfies that desire, in my opinion. But
just one core bottling that's like
Yeah.
a strain.
absolutely, and we used to have it, and they decided it wasn't worthwhile. So never know, we might get something back in the future. But Project 20 was the closest we could find. So if you can find that, grab that one.
Yeah, I have that. That's good.
Yeah, my grandparents kept a bottle of Glenfiddich 12 since my mom was a kid, and that was the bottle for company. Like, they had their normal drinkers that they had every day, but the Glenfiddich 12 was for when company came over. And that was just how we always recognized that was the nice scotch. And but it was funny because they drank scotch so often in just giant tumbler filled with ice and water, and would sip on that for 3 hours a night. But they lived in the same house for like 50 years. So it permeated the entire, like the wood, the furniture, the carpet, everything. And I used to joke that the smell of scotch, especially Glenfiddich 12, is a childhood memory for me. And people look at me like I'm in danger. But it's like, no, it's going to grandma's house and you just smell that vanillas and the oaks and all of that. And it just kind of lingers.
Awesome.
So we have a couple of early drinkers in this crowd, right? So Jane, right, with her uncle.
Like, how early do you drink? 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock?
No, funny.
Not early in the day, early in their lifetime.
New drinkers, yeah.
I started drinking early too, but it wasn't until I was like 17 or 18 that I started drinking whiskey. So, and that was when I had the wisdom teeth were coming in and giving me problems. And whiskey was the only thing that calmed it. So, good.
Has many uses.
And then the rest of us are latecomers.
Yeah.
10 years.
I don't believe you for a second, Brian.
No, me, I started with wine, and even that was late. But whiskey and bourbon, I mean, before the craze, but only like 10 years ago, 10, 11, something like that.
Can you imagine getting into it 20 years ago and stashing away lots of old 21s and Macallans and all sorts of stuff?
I look back at my stuff and what I paid, and I'm like, oh, imagine it was just 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier.
Well,
Yeah.
When I started with the company, we did a 50-year-old Glenfiddich tasting. That bottle at the time was retailing for 18,000. It's retailing now for 36,000, double 10 years later.
Wow.
So you stash a few of those.
Yeah, at 18,000, it was a steal. Could have bought it then.
I mean, to me at the time, it was just like so expensive. Like the thought of that, I was so new to the concept of tens of thousands of dollars for a bottle of anything. And now obviously you look back and you're like, wow, that was an absolute steal.
Yeah, but
And I still look back.
but still, it was
myself.
18,000.
5 years ago, a $50 bottle was expensive, and now I'm like, oh, $100. That seems reasonable. Cool.
But at the same time, some of the simpler stuff. I mean, the first bottle of scotch I bought was maybe 2005, and it was a Balvenie 12, and that thing cost me $90-something because the distribution wasn't there. That was in Tennessee. They didn't have a lot of it. The price of it for getting it was expensive because nobody, they didn't sell it.
Yeah.
So there are some things that, the prices keep going up, but for other things, the price went down because people started making more.
Right. And if you're in a smaller market, maybe there's maybe the buyers are a little more savvy. They realize that, hey, we only get X amount of cases to the state, so we can charge whatever we want for it.
Right. Yeah, because you're not going to be able to get it anywhere else. There's certainly no online buying at that point.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, look, this has been absolutely fantastic. I'm not kicking anybody out ever. You're all welcome to hang out, but I do want to say thanks and give people the opportunity if they need to jump off to be able to. So I'm going to finish the recording and we can all just hang out off record. So cheers. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dave, for being here to tell us all about the brand and share these wonderful whiskeys with us. Thank you, everyone. Cheers, and I'll see you next week for the next tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. Cheers, everyone.
Guys, we'll talk soon, Vadim.
Thank you.
Absolutely.